So, of course, welcome everyone to this month's Alignment Jam on Interpretability again with the great Neel Nanda, who has graced us with his presence from the DeepMind conference offices here, well-lit conference offices. And of course, thank you very much to him for coming. And Neel Nanda is an amazing researcher. He's done a lot of work in interpretability and been a big voice in spreading it and making it available for a lot of budding researchers, a lot of starting researchers, with both YouTube videos and some of the public discourse on interpretability that's like super interesting. He has previously worked with Anthropic. That's perfect. I think that's the good public discourse, right? But yes, Neel Nanda has also worked with Chris Olah, one of the founders of the mechanistic interpretability field. I would say it seems that way at least. Who is working at Anthropic now, and he has also been with FHI and with a few other organizations. So thank you very much to Neel for coming, and I will kick it off to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I should probably also add the context that I spent a while as an independent interpretability researcher and recently joined the DeepMind interpretability team. But yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me, and I'm super excited to see how many people are excited about interpretability. Yeah, so welcome everyone to the Mechanistic Interpretability Alignment Jam. This is going to be a lightly adapted version of my previous keynote. So if you've watched that, you can just like, I don't know, go hack around stuff on your own. But this is a whirlwind tour of what mechanistic interpretability is and a bunch of open problems in it. And I have an orientation to what are things that I think someone could like get some traction on in a weekend. And this is, you can see the slides at this link, and I'm going to be maybe Esmond, if you could put this link in the chat, that would be great. These slides are going to be full of links and resources, so I recommend checking them out. The key things are, this is an ad for my concrete open problem sequence, which is a sequence called 200 concrete open problems in mechanistic interpretability. I've got a post on how to get started in the field, and there's a very abridged version of that called the MechInterp Quick Start Guide at neelnanda.io/quickstart that I believe is the main resources for this hackathon. And this library I wrote called Transformer Lens for doing mechanistic interpretability on language models that will hopefully save you a bunch of the incredibly tedious infrastructure setup that you need to do before you can do anything in these models. And yeah, the spirit of this presentation is going to be a whirlwind tour, roughly split into discrete parts. I'll aim to go fast, and I'll flag when I'm switching area, so if you zone out or get confused, you can rezone back in. And yeah, so high-level motivation. What is mechanistic interpretability? What is the point of all this? I think that a key question basically anyone doing anything in AI should be asking themselves is, what does my research look like in a post-GPT-4 world? And to me, the key thing is large generative language models are a really big deal, and we either want to be aggressively pursuing extremely scalable techniques that can be relevant to the biggest models, or we want to try to be aiming for fundamental insights that will let us be able to tackle models at any scale better. And I would roughly categorize MechInterp in the second category, though I'll discuss a bunch throughout this ways in which I think it links to stuff that's actually relevant. And yeah, one high-level motivating thing is I think that if you want to do interpretability work that is relevant to alignment, a bunch of the standard approaches to interpretability that look at things like the inputs and outputs of the model are just basically wildly insufficient for models that are GPT-4 level and above. And here's a particularly evocative example from the GPT-4 system card, where Paul Cusciano's Alignment Research Center tried to get GPT-4 to get a TaskRabbit worker to solve a CAPTCHA, and it was able to competently reason through that it should manipulate the TaskRabbit worker, and then gave a pretty convincing lie. And when you have a model that is smart enough to be able to solve the task of understand what its operator wants to hear, even if it may not have the agency or goal directness to do this, I think you really want interpretability to be able to work in that world. And I would operationalize this goal as to try to understand the model's cognition. What is the thought process and algorithm that generated its outputs? And in particular, to what degree is the model aligned, or just telling us what we want it to hear? And this is very much my high-level motivation of this whole thing. The actual stuff I'm going to talk about is much more grounded and zoomed in, but this is just like some broad picture, how I think about interpretability, why I care about these things. All right, so in necessary context to jump into the actual problems is just briefly outlining what is a transformer, the neural network architecture that underlies basically all interesting modern language models. And Wilbur Tor, transformers take as input a sequence of words. Words is actually tokens, which are kind of subwords, but this is an annoying nuance that's not important for the intuition, but is very important for like actually doing research on them. The output of the model is a probability distribution over the next word, though a key nuance is that actually the output is a sequence of probability distributions over the next word, where for every word in the sequence, the model makes a prediction for what the word after that will be. And transformers are set up so information can only move forwards through the network, which means that, I don't know, if you're trying to predict the 8th word after the 7th word, the model can't just cheat and look at the 8th word. And the internal of the model, the internal representations of the model, is what's called the residual stream. This is a sequence of representations, one for each of the input tokens, and there's a different residual stream after each layer. And the way to intuitively think about the residual stream is it's representing the word plus a bunch of context and processing and computed information. And every layer of the model is an incremental update to the residual stream that does some additional processing and computation and refines the representation of the word, until at the very end it can predict what should come next. There's two types of layers. The first is attention layers, which move information between words. Attention layers are made up of heads, each of which act independently and in parallel. And they look at all previous residual streams, identify which ones are most relevant, and collect some information from there and move it to the current residual stream. And generally, a lot of what we've had the most luck with in mech-interp is trying to interpret heads. The second type of layer are the MLP layers, which process information once it has been moved to a word. Very roughly, attention is like the plumbing that moves information around, because transformers operate on sequences. MLPs are the bit where the thinking happens once all of the key information has been collected. And I have these two walkthroughs, one being a 1-hour YouTube video explaining what a transformer is, and a more fleshed out version than what I just said, and the second as a coding tutorial of actually writing GPT-2 from scratch, with an accompanying template you can fill out yourself as or before you watch. Generally, I think that one of the more productive things you can do when trying to do transformer mech-interp is just get the basics of how a transformer works, and spending at least some time going through some mix of these walkthroughs, if you've never dealt with transformers before, I think is a pretty solid place to start. All right, end context. Hope that was helpful and not too boring for the people who already knew it. Now, what is mechanistic interpretability? So, the broad spirit of the field is goal. Reverse engineer neural networks. Analogous to how we might take a compiled program binary and try to reverse engineer that to get the source code. And it's built on this bold and ambitious hypothesis that neural networks learn human comprehensible algorithms and can be understood in principle, but that models are not incentivized to make these algorithms legible to us. They learn a black box stack of matrices that get good performance on the task they're given, but that a consequence of the structure of a network is that it's incentivized to form certain kinds of algorithms, and that by learning the right techniques and mindsets and hacks, we can decode this and get some insight into what they're doing. And this is possible, but also really hard. And there's two key concepts for reasoning about what goes on inside models. The first are features, the variables inside the model, and properties of the inputs, like this is a noun, or this is a list variable whose first element is 1 in Python code, or any other property of the integer that could possibly be useful. And the second are circuits. Circuits are the algorithms the model has learned, which generally act to take some features and compute more features, until at the very end you can compute the feature of what you think the next token is. And generally, features are represented in the model's activations, circuits are represented in the model's weights. And a key property of mechinterp done well is that it will let us, because we're trying to deeply engage with the algorithms in the model, we should be able to distinguish between different kinds of model cognition that produce identical outputs. And my personal hot take is that a deep knowledge of circuits is basically crucial to understand, predict, and align model behavior, and that without it, we're just pretty hopelessly confused about what's going on inside of them. In the bottom right, we have a cute toy example of features and circuits taken from an image classification model. The psychedelic pictures represent neurons that are detecting different features of the input, car windows, car bodies, and car wheels, and here's a circuit, which is some convolutional weights assembling these neurons into a neuron in the next layer, which seems to detect cars. And here's a bunch of papers that can be argued to be mechinterp, though definitions wildly vary. But there's like a bunch of stuff and a diverse range of stuff, though I'm going to be focusing on what I personally am most excited about. On a more personal front, why am I doing mechanistic interpretability? Or specifically, why do I enjoy doing mechanistic interpretability? Why is this a thing that I chose over other things that seem equivalently impactful? And one thing that's really great about it, in particular as a thing to get into or do a hackathon in, is it's very easy to get started, and it's very easy to start getting feedback loops. A key thing you really need to do whenever you're getting into any new field is get contact with reality and be able to distinguish whether what you're doing is bullshit or useful, and you're poking at a model and you're getting feedback of what your hypotheses look like. It's great. It's also just really fun. I have a pure maths background, and to me the vibe is kind of a mix between maths, because I'm trying to reason about what is essentially a massive stack of linear algebra, computer science, because I'm reasoning through the algorithms and implementation details and various crap about the model, natural science, because I'm fundamentally trying to be an empiricist. I form hypotheses, I test the hypotheses, and truth-seeking, because there is a ground of truth to be gained about the model. It is hard and confusing, but I can track down that truth, and I can believe there is an answer out there. And my high-level advice to people getting into the field is code early and code a lot. By far the most common mistake I see is people who just spend months reading papers and thinking about things and never just opening a Colab notebook and playing with a model, which is one of the reasons I'm really excited to help out with these hackathons, because it is a structure where it's kind of socially awkward if you just spend a weekend reading and try to write no code. So go forth and write code. And yeah, here's a post I made with a bunch of more concrete advice on how to get started. All right, concrete examples of mechinterp and areas of open problems. Features. What does the model know? So one of the beliefs I generally have about networks is that models a lot of what they're doing is trying to extract features of the input and represent them internally as essentially directions in the residual stream, or sometimes it's individual neurons. And here is a wild graphic showing a bunch of neurons that was found in a model called CLIP in the multimodal neurons paper. And these are just like a bunch of really wild abstract neurons, like activates on pictures containing the concept of teenageriness, or the concept of happiness, or Hinduism, or Donald Trump. This one also activates on things like MAGA hats and Republican politicians. You have Europe, or group photos, and it's just like, what? These are things the model learns and can represent internally. And generally the study of what features are inside a model is much better explored for image models than language models, which is sad, but also exciting, because I think there's a bunch of progress here that someone can make in a weekend, even with no prior knowledge of mech and terp. One of my favorite papers that properly dug into this, though I'm very biased because I am an author on it, is softmax linear units, where one of the fun and underrated parts of it is a bunch of qualitative exploration of the kinds of weird neurons they found inside models. My favorite is this numbers that implicitly describe numbers of people neuron, which we can see activates on things like 150 and 6 and 70, but not on things like 2, because 2 does not describe a group of people. And I made this tool called Neuroscope, which takes a bunch of open source language models, and for each neuron in the model, it gives you a page showing the text that most activates that neuron. And generally, if you look at this and you see like a clear pattern in those texts, that's evidence that that's what the neuron is detecting. Here's one random neuron I found in a one-layer model, which seems to mostly be activating on the in the after a verb involving running, like walked or ran or running or even running windows. And I guess this is useful for the model. It's also just kind of cute and wild. And one of the posts in my open problem sequence is on studying learned features with a bunch of ideas for what to do here. But the main concrete project I'd recommend people try is just go and poke around in the middle layers of the largest models in there, like GPT-2 XL, and just see if you can find any fun and weird features like this. And I give a bunch of advice in this post for what rigorously identifying features should look like. It's not enough to just notice patterns. You want to be editing the text that goes into the model, trying to find counterexamples, trying to check if your hypothesis is too general or too specific, and just trying to do science to it. I think this is a particularly accessible entry point because you just really don't need to know that much about coding. All right, pivot, new area. Circuits, which are analogous to functions or subroutines or algorithms in the model. How does the model think? And one of my favorite examples of a circuit is this phenomena called an induction heads, which we found in this paper I was involved in called a mathematical framework, where we looked at toy two-layer attention-only language models, that is, models with just 2 layers and without the MLP layers, and we found that, so a thing which is true about text is it often contains repeated substrings. Like, if you see Neel in the text, and you saw Neel Nanda previously in the text, it's a lot more likely that Nanda is going to come next, and than it would be if you just saw Neel in isolation. And this turns out to be an insanely useful algorithm for models to learn. And induction heads are a simple circuit where 2 heads in different layers work together to detect if the current token has come up before, and if so, look at what came after it, and then predict that that comes next. And This is like a genuine algorithm the model has learned that is applied on the text given to it at input time. And by circuit, I mean this kind of actual algorithm the model runs. Notably, the fact that we can find algorithms like this, in my opinion, just completely disproves the strongest forms of language models only learn statistical correlations and never learn real reasoning. But okay, and an area of open problem I'm pretty excited about is just going and poking around in toy language models. I open sourced 12 toy language models I trained, and trying to see what you can find. I'm particularly excited for people to take a one-layer model with MLPs and try to understand what the MLPs in that model are doing, because we're just really bad at transformer MLPs, and no one has checked very hard. And I think there's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit that could tell us exciting things. And here is something I'm not going to go into in detail, but a great blog post from Callum McDougall outlining what the actual algorithm learned by the model is, where very roughly there's something in the first layer where an attention head acts to copy information from a token to the one after, and a head in the next layer which checks whether the current token matches the previous token of something in the past, and if so, predict that that comes next. That was probably too fast for anyone to follow, but you should totally go read this blog post, and it's great. And so a natural reaction many people have to Mechinterp is, sure, this is really pretty, but you're just looking at kind of cute toy things and this is never going to matter. And a great paper, a paper I was involved in, which I personally think is great, but I'm extremely biased, is Induction Heads and In-Context Learning, which is a sequel paper to a mathematical framework. And in this, we try to investigate the phenomena of in-context learning in models. In-context learning is when a model is capable of tracking long-range dependencies in text, like using information more than a paragraph or two back to predict the word that comes next. And you can measure this by just checking, are models better at predicting things later in a document than earlier in the document? And it is kind of wild that models can do this. Like, usefully using information like a page ago to predict what comes next is actually kind of hard and non-trivial. But models are pretty good at this, and in much bigger models, this leads to very striking stuff like few-shot learning, where you give models a few examples of task, and it seems to suddenly become better at it. And actually, we found that in-context learning is an emergent property, meaning that when you train a model, it goes from not very good at in-context learning to very good at it very rapidly during a narrow band of training. And this only happens in models that are 2 layers and above, and not in models that are 1 layer. And these are just tiny models, but you get the same striking emergence in much larger models. And what we found in this paper is that this emergence of in-context learning seems deeply causally linked to induction heads. Induction heads also form in a phase transition at the same time, and we present a bunch of evidence, like that if you ablate an induction head, this will disproportionately damage in-context learning. And a caveat I should give to this, that I think is an easy way to misunderstand the paper, is that when I say induction head here, I'm referring to a behaviorally induction head, something which can do the task of check whether the current token came before and predict what came after it, but where I'm not making any strong claims that it has literally the mechanism I outlined here. And I think an area of exciting work someone could do in this hackathon is take a model that has induction heads but is bigger than the toy ones we looked at and try to really understand what's going on there. But I think the fact that heads that seem to be doing induction-y stuff seem deeply causally linked to in-context learning is just kind of wild, and makes me a lot more optimistic that MechInterp can teach us real things that matter about models, where the theory of impact here is there's a bunch of important and confusing behavior in large models. Can we study it in smaller toy settings and use this to demystify and ideally predict and understand it better in real models? And an area of open problems that builds on this is my post on analyzing training dynamics. We just don't really know much about what happens inside a model as it trains, and I expect there's lots of fascinating and interesting mysteries to uncover here. In particular, a thing which is really concerning about cutting-edge models is that they have emergent behavior. If you train them for long enough or make them bigger, sometimes they will suddenly become able to do things. And there's some moderately compelling evidence that this is partially due to them just suddenly being able to learn circuits they didn't have before. And I think that by better interpreting what happens in a model during training, we should be able to become somewhat less confused about this. All right. End previous section. New section. What is the mindset and vibe of mechanistic interpretability? This is just like a few principles that I find useful for thinking about the field. 1. Mechanistic interpretability is like doing alien neuroscience. Models are interpretable, but not in our language. We need to learn how they think and how they represent things, and if we do, a lot of things that seem mysterious can dissolve. 2. Skepticism. It's just so easy to trick yourself. It's so easy to come up with some elaborate, complex hypothesis about models that actually is just kind of BS, and there's a much simpler thing going on. And one thing this motivates me to believe is that we should significantly prioritize deep, rigorous dives into models and really understanding them over things that superficially look broad and scalable, but where it's just really easy to be doing total nonsense and where you don't understand what's going on. Ambition. It is possible to achieve deep and rigorous understanding of these models. It's hard and confusing and fucky, but there is a goal worth aiming for. And I don't think this is like actually guaranteed, but I see the field in part as a bet that even if the specific circuits we're finding in small models won't generalize or aren't that interesting, there are underlying principles and structures to these models that we can understand that do generalize and can let us gain insight that genuinely matters. And here's a case study of some independent work that I led on grokking that I think is a good illustration that if you really understand something mechanistically, this can help dissolve mysteries and confusions around it. So grokking was this wild phenomena that was found in this OpenAI paper last year, where they found that if you train small models on algorithmic tasks, like modular division, mod 97, that the model will initially memorize the data it's trained on and do terribly on the data it hasn't seen. And it gets basically perfect accuracy. But then if you keep training for a really long time, the model will suddenly grok and learn to generalize. And it's like, what? Why does this happen? In particular, naively, the model's already good at the task. It should just continue memorizing. Why on earth would it generalize? And why on earth would it take so long? And I tried to investigate I was like, this is a weird phenomena. This happens in small models. It's an algorithmic task. Mechanistic interpretability should just obviously work here. And this should just obviously be the morally correct way to figure out what's going on here. And I found this circuit for modular addition in a one-layer transformer, which I trained to grok modular addition. And we found that the model doesn't like thinking about modular addition in nice normal ways, like addition or binary addition, like a computer would do it. Instead, models like to think in trig functions. The model decides to think about the inputs A and B as rotations around the unit circle, proportional to A and B. It memorizes a discrete Fourier transform to convert the inputs to these trig terms. It uses trig identities to compose the rotations. And this is addition, and it automatically gives you mod because it wraps around the circle. And then it uses the unembedding, the final map from the final residual stream to the logits, to undo this by rotating backwards by every possible output rotation C, and looking for the one whose projection onto the x-axis is the biggest, using the fact that only if C is A plus B mod n does rotating back by C get you to the do-nothing rotation. And firstly, what? How is this how a model learns to do modular rotation? But I also think this is a really beautiful illustration of alien neuroscience. The model was initially incomprehensible, but once I realized it was doing galaxy brain Fourier stuff, everything became much clearer. And another area of open problems that I'm excited about is interpreting algorithmic models. Taking models like the modular addition model, trained on some algorithmic task, and trying to understand how they do this. And I think this is an unusually accessible area where you might be able to get some real traction over a weekend. And just as a pretty demonstration that really understanding circuits can actually matter. So this animation, on the left, we have, this is an animation of the model as it trains. This is the loss curve. This is the embedding. And when the embedding is sparse, that shows that the model has learned the trig algorithm. When it's dense, it shows the model is just memorizing. And we see that during this long seeming plateau before it groks, the model is actually learning the true circuit. And it's slowly transitioning from the memorizing circuit to the generalizing circuit. And the crash only happens when the model gets so good at generalizing, it decides it no longer needs to memorize and it gets rid of that circuit. And because we understand what's going on internally, we can just look inside and see what's going on. And it's so pretty. And, all right, new area. This time I'm talking about a frontier of the field where we're just kind of confused, more so than an area where I want to showcase like really exciting and inspiring work, which is a confusion. How do models represent their thoughts? So in order to do mechanistic interpretability, we really need to deeply engage with how the models represent the features and other knowledge they have internally. And naively, our prior might have been that they would store the features corresponding to individual neurons, because models want to be able to store and reason about features independently, and models have what are called activation functions, nonlinear functions like ReLUs and JeLUs that act independently on each neuron. And so naively, if you store a feature in each neuron, then this will operate independently and everything is good. But this turns out to not always be the case. This is an example of a neuron in the multimodal neurons paper. When you apply a technique called feature visualization to visualize what the neuron is looking at, you see a bunch of cards and dice, and it looks kind of like a game neuron. But then if you look at the images the neuron most activates on, half of them are about games and poker, and then half of them are about poetry. And it's like, what? And this is just actually a pretty general and confusing problem called polysemanticity, where neurons represent multiple things. And I have a list of open problems trying to understand what on earth is going on with polysemanticity. And a hypothesis put forward in this great paper, Toy Models of Superposition, is that polysemanticity is because of superposition. Superposition is the phenomena where models use where models want to represent more features than they have dimensions. And they learn to do compression, where they shove in more features than they have dimensions. Here, they just have 2 features in 2 dimensions, everything's normal. Here, they have 4 features in 2 dimensions, and here they have 5 features in 2 dimensions. And they exhibit a toy model and show that superposition can happen in it. But they don't actually investigate real models. And an area that I'm really excited about is just going and looking at real models and trying to understand what's up with polysemanticity and seeing how much the predictions of this paper bear out, and in particular, whether you can actually observe any superposition or just any of the other predictions of this paper. Like the really important things will get their own dimension, but unimportant things will be in superposition. And one thing which I think is a particularly tractable area is again looking at the MLP layers of 1 or 2 layer toy language models and just seeing what are the features that are represented there. How are they computed? If a feature is represented by many neurons, how does that work? How is the model using the nonlinear activations across many features? And the toy model superposition paper, I think, did some genuinely great work trying to clarify our conceptual frameworks for thinking about models, particularly with this glorious picture exploring the geometry of superposition. So what this graphic shows is that you have a model that's trying to compress about 100 features into 20 dimensions. And they measure for each feature what fraction of a dimension does this take up in the model. And they find that the features self-organize into orthogonal subspaces where some number of features are shoved in. So here, they spontaneously self-organize into tetrahedra, groups of 3 dimensions with 4 features in. Here they self-organize into triangles and antipodal pairs. Here they self-organize into pentagons and antipodal pairs and square antiprisms. And this behemoth they call the everything bagel. And does this happen in real models? I have no idea, but it's beautiful. And I think that another exciting direction is working with toy models and trying to clarify our conceptual frameworks for how to think about superposition. In particular, in the paper, they focus on how to compress features into a subspace linearly and recover them linearly, and briefly have a section on computation and superposition, where they look at compressing things into neurons. I'm particularly excited about compressing things into neurons, and I think that if you dig further into those models, you might find some cool insights, maybe analogous to this. Well, this is very unrealistic to get in a weekend, but you can get something that could be a step towards something like this for understanding what's up with neurons. All right, new case study. If you were zoning out or confused, you can now zone back in. Case study, interpretability in the wild. Seeing what's out there. So, interpretability in the wild is this great paper from Kevin Wang when he was interning at Redwood Research, exploring the phenomena of indirect object identification in GPT-2 small. Indirect object identification is the grammatical task of saying when you've got sentences like this, the final word, the next word is going to be Mary, the name which is not repeated, rather than John, the name which is repeated. And this is a grammatical task. It comes up enough that models care about solving it. And it's also kind of clean and algorithmic, but also genuinely non-trivial. And they found this wild 25-head circuit in GPT-2 small that did this task. Very roughly, there's a bunch of heads which tell that the John token was duplicated, storing this information on the second John residual stream. There are these S inhibition heads that move that information from John to the final token 2. Again, there's a separate residual stream on each token, and so attention heads serve the role of moving information around. And finally, we have these name mover heads that copy all non-duplicated names to the final token position. And I think this is just really cool work, and that a lot of the techniques they use are just things that you could copy. And I think that trying to find and understand some circuit analogies to this is like a really practical hackathon project. And last time there was this great work trying to look into a gender bias circuit that I think made some solid progress. And I have this open problem post on finding circuits in the wild. And so why care about this? I don't intrinsically think that indirect object identification is like an important model capability. Why is this work useful? So one of the reasons I'm excited about this kind of work is that you're seeing what's out there. You're seeing what weird phenomena actually arise in practice in a model. And two things I want to draw attention to are these negative name mover heads, which systematically do the opposite of the IOI task. They boost the duplicated name, not the indirect object name. And even weirder, backup name mover heads, which only if one of the name mover heads is ablated, that is, deleted or removed, do the backup name mover heads take over to compensate. And here's a scatter plot of this. We look at the direct effect of every head on the logits, and then we ablate one of the key name movers, and we see what happens. The key name mover goes from big effect to 0, because it was removed. And then if we look at the actual heads, then most of them don't change that much, but there are like 2 or 3 heads that massively move off diagonal. And this is a negative head that becomes much less negative. This is a backup head which didn't do much before, but now does a fair bit. And what? Why does this happen? What is going on? And I'm particularly excited about this because ablations are a common technique used in interpretability that to some people feel like strong and compelling evidence. And this is like a concrete case study, which we only found by looking hard for a circuit, which shows that ablations can be deeply misleading because models learn redundant behavior and forms of backup. And this is what I call mechanistic interpretability as a validation set. We ultimately want to be forming much more automated and scalable methods, whether to find circuits or to do other things about models. But I think that only by having different contexts where we really understand a circuit can we go and really check how much our scalable techniques work and whether we're finding real insight or tricking ourselves. And I outline a bunch of open problems along these lines in my techniques, tooling, and automation post. One that I'll call out is just going and looking for other kinds of backup behavior in models like GPT-2 and other ones. Are there backup induction heads? Is backupness a general phenomena? Can you make any progress understanding the circuits behind backup behavior? Another reason I'm excited about this kind of work is helping us refine good techniques. If we practice finding circuits, we'll get better practical knowledge about what finding those circuits looks like, what useful techniques are, and hopefully inventing some new techniques. And this is a technique called activation patching that was used to solid effect in the Rome paper called Locating and Editing Factual Associations in GPT, where the key idea is you have 2 inputs where the model gives different outputs. Here we've got the Big Bang Theory premieres on, maps to CBS, the clean input, and we've got the corrupted input where we mess up the input token somehow. We then choose some activation from the clean run the model on the corrupted inputs, but then at a single point, replace that activation with the clean activation. And this is a causal intervention. And we see how much this changes the model's output, and how much it flips it from the incorrect output given on the corrupted prompt to the correct output given on the clean prompt. And generally, most activations do nothing, while a few do a lot. And this is a fairly rigorous causal intervention that can let us really localize which bits of the model matter for some computation. And this is like one of the techniques I'm most excited about that has come out of mechanistic interpretability in the last year or two. And I think this kind of thing is like solid and scalable and can tell us something genuinely useful even about much larger models. And I go through a bunch of other things you might try building on this. One thing which I don't actually think is in that post is I have this blog post on what I call attribution patching, which is a gradient-based approximation to activation patching that can be much faster. And but also I haven't checked very hard how well it works, and I'd love to see people just go and test run it on a bunch of circuits and see what happens. And I have this tutorial for transformer lens called Exploratory Analysis Demo, where I go through a bunch of these basic techniques and how you'd use them to analyze something like the IOI circuit. And I generally highly recommend finding some existing code like this and heavily stealing from it for a hackathon project, because if you need to write everything from scratch, you're not going to make that much progress in a weekend. And the final thing I want to discuss is the idea that models have underlying principles with real predictive power that we can uncover by deeply reverse engineering them, and then use these principles to predict and become less confused about model behavior and feature. And the one I want to focus on is the linear representation hypothesis. The hypothesis that models represent features, these variables and properties of the inputs they've learned to compute, as directions in space. That is, directions in their activations. If you project the residual stream onto some vector, you can identify this feature. And this was first popularized in the Word2Vec paper like 10 years ago, most famous for the king minus man equals queen minus woman claim, that there's some male minus female direction and some is royalty direction. And this is, to me, fairly intuitive, but also like a very strong and bold claim about models. Not only do they process and do computation on the inputs, but that specifically they represent these as directions in space. And this is an example of the kind of thing I mean by models have structures that incentivize them to learn stuff that is understandable, but have no incentive to make it legible to us. Models are made of linear algebra, which incentivizes them to learn things like features as directions, but I don't know, the directions aren't stuff that's clear to us, we need to go and find them. And I now want to go through a case study of showing that this has real predictive power. There was this great paper called Emergent World Representations, studying a model called Othello GPT that was trained to make random legal moves in the game of Othello. Othello is a Go or chess-like board game where you place pieces, and each time you play a piece, you need to take some of the opponent's pieces, which flips their color. And importantly, they took a GPT-2 style language model and just trained it to predict the next token on a bunch of random legal Othello games. And they had this fascinating result that the model learned an emergent world representation. Despite only ever seeing data about moves and next moves, the model learned to compute the actual state of the board. And you could extract the state of the board with a nonlinear probe on the model's residual stream, and you could use the probe to intervene on the model's representation of the board. And if you did this, the model would now make legal moves in the intervened on board, even if the intervened on board was impossible to get by normal play. And this paper rightly got a lot of hype because this is striking evidence that that language models may actually form models of the world, despite only ever being told to predict the next word. But the thing which to me was really interesting about this paper is that they could only find the model of the board if they used non-linear probes, but not if they used linear probes. That is, there were no directions in space corresponding to, is this square black or white? But if you took the simplest nonlinear function and one hidden layer MLP, you could recover it. And that you needed to do some complex optimization against this nonlinear probe to edit the board. And this seemed like strong evidence against the nonlinear representation, so the linear representation hypothesis, because it clearly has a model of the board, because you can intervene on it, but linear probes didn't find it. What's going on? I did this investigation, where I found that actually the model does have a linear representation, but that rather than the model learning this cell is black or white, the model doesn't care about black or white. The model cares about whether a cell has my color, the current player's color, or the opponent's color, because the model is playing both black and white moves. This graphic shows the model's representation of the board extracted after a move, and then on the next move, you can extract it again. It's perfectly correct, but it's now flipped sides, because whoever's playing next has changed. And to me, this is a really exciting case study that there are real underlying principles about models. In particular, a thing we found when looking at words-to-vec language models has held up both on image models, on transformers, and now on this weird Othello playing model. And despite the evidence pointing against, when they had these great results that seemed genuinely nonlinear. And I have this blog post where I go through my investigation, and I have in particular, I've got a post where I have a long list of open problems I'd love to see people work on, including a section of specific recommended concrete starter projects. One of the things I'm really excited about is that because I found a linear model, you can also linearly intervene on the model I found to change the model's output move. Is that this is an example of a circuit where the first half of the model converts the input to something, the board state, and the second half uses that to figure out the next move. And so the model has become spontaneously modular. It's split into 2 bits that communicate via some interface we can understand. And basically all prior work looking for circuits and language models has been on end-to-end circuits, things that go from the inputs to the outputs where most of the model doesn't matter. And I'm really excited. I feel like this is not going to generalize to enormous models, and we need to get good at understanding how to find... We need to get good at understanding how to understand how models are modular and how to find different bits of them that produce features that other bits use. And I think that Othello GPT and understanding the circuits behind its board state computation and its board state using is a really exciting case study because it's simple and algorithmic enough to be tractable. We have this linear probe, but it's also complex enough that I don't know how it works, and I expect to learn cool things from it. And yeah, that closes my talk. The 4 resources that I think are hopefully particularly helpful: 200 concrete open problems, mechanistic interpretability, the sequence I've been shelling this whole talk, a post on how to get started that just gives a lot of my distilled advice on how to get traction. If you change the getting started to quick start, I have an even more abridged version for hackathons. A comprehensive mech-interp explainer, which you can just go and look up any terms you come across that confuse you, and where I have lots of long, sweeping, intuitive tangents, and my transformer lens library, which is tooling I highly recommend using for any of the projects I've outlined, because I've tried to optimize it for being stuff that I want to use when doing research, and I think that if you go in having decent tooling, you'll be able to make so much more progress. And yeah, that ends the main part of my talk. happy to take questions depending on how much time we have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Neel. And let's just give him a hand. You'll just get the Copenhagen hands here. But anyone who wants to ask any questions, so I can probably start out. So in general, I'm curious which type of tooling there is available now, and what type of tooling you're seeing as something that is needed, because now you have the transformer lens, but there's also stuff like AC/DC, right, and these other tools. But is there something where you're like, oh, this seems to be missing?
Yeah, so the core thing Transformer Lens tries to do is it gives you really easy access to the model's internals. You can cache any activation, you can change and edit any activation on the fly, the nice interface that gets rid of a lot of the foot guns, plus a lot of other stuff that improves your quality of life. Also recently found a maintainer for it, so I don't even know what's in that nowadays. But it sure seems like it's good that it has a person who actually writes tests. So thanks, Joseph. AC/DC, the thing has been mentioned, is this thing being developed by Arthur Conmee at Conjecture, which stands for Automatic Circuit Discovery Code. That's an automated tool for looking at taking some circuit you think a model has, and essentially showing you which bits of the model and which connections between them, like which heads and which MLPs are actually important for that task. And I'm pretty excited about more stuff like that existing, though my main hesitation is I'm not sure how well we understand what this should look like, or what the right ergonomics and design principles should look like. But that I'd think about this more as a research project of try different approaches to automatically finding circuits, see how well they work and how well they compare to the circuits we understand. Ideally, have a validation set of more than 2 circuits. But yeah, I think work just trying to refine automated ways to find circuits feels exciting to me. I'm pretty excited about Neuroscope, where my general vision for it is a general wiki for a model, where you can, a general wiki for a model, where you can look up any neuron or any head and get a bunch of automated metrics for it. I haven't actually had the time to go and make Neuroscope not a mess, but I would love if anyone here is interested in going and doing that. And also, if you want to work on a hackathon project involving Neuroscope, I can get you, if you DM me, I can get you the data, which I should really get around to open sourcing properly. You do not need to scrape the website. And yeah, other tooling, generally working with large models and models split across GPUs, or God forbid, servers, is an enormous pain. I believe we either have just merged in or will soon merge in something to Transformer Lens that lets you do that. Though it's a bit janky, it's a bit hacky, and it doesn't work across devices. And I think there's also ways to streamline that. So that's the kind of thing you generally want to do more when you're a company or an org with their own infra, rather than a general open source library. Yeah. The tooling. Yeah, a general tension I have is how much, with research style tooling, is how much you should just have generic, very ergonomic tools that you can use to implement any random idea moderately fast, versus something you can just click a button and do lots of stuff with very limited customizability. And I go back and forth what I think the right thing to do is here. Generally, I aesthetically flavor really things that let you convert experiment ideas to code as fast as possible across a wide range of experiments, and stuff that does a specific thing without much flexibility. Yeah, I'm a researcher. This is my aesthetic. It does make things less user-friendly, less beginner-friendly.
Yeah, wonderful.
So we've got a question from Gubbins in the chat in how does activation patching compare to integrated gradients in terms of resolving circuits? So So integrated gradients is an interpretability technique where you so the idea is you've got a bunch of inputs to the model, like pixels in an image that you change from like image 1 to image 2. You look at some output that changes, like the probability of something being a dog, and you then kind of incrementally, you like take, I don't know, 1,000 small linear steps between the two, look at the gradients at each point, and look at the integral of the gradient with respect to each of the pixels of the image to like attribute how much each pixel affects that output. I've mostly seen it applied on input-output things, which, as I've hopefully established, I think is boring. But the same idea totally transfers to like, how does varying each of these neurons in parallel in a layer affect this output log drop? Or how does varying these neurons affect this neuron? It's honestly not obvious to me how I would apply integrated gradients to attention heads. You could kind of, because it tries to attribute things to scalars and heads are bigger than scalars, you could kind of apply it to activation patterns. Honestly, I've seen basically no work trying to use integrated gradients with circuits. There's this one paper looking for knowledge neurons in models, which claims to use it, though they seem to not really use the power of it, because rather than changing a bunch of neurons at once and attributing, you just change single neurons in isolation, which doesn't tell you that much. I think it'd be a cool project to try to figure out how to apply integrated gradients to IOI and see what happens. Yeah. Generally, I'm pretty excited about better exploring gradient-based methods, because gradient-based methods are like... Alright. I'm excited about exploring gradient-based methods because gradient-based methods actually are just much more scalable. It can give you more insight than just like, does this directly affect the output? I just copied into the chat the post I wrote on attribution patching, which is a gradient-based approximation to activation patching that I mentioned. And I'm excited. I'd be excited to see some projects trying to refine and build on that. In particular, just like, go and try to speedrun finding a bunch of circuits, or take circuits we understand and try to understand what's going on there. I have accompanying code and a bunch of open problems in the post.
Hello. No, it wasn't. Sorry, it wasn't like a question. It was more like a point of information, I guess. So on the integrated gradient, there is this paper that I've recently come across called, which I don't remember the title anymore, but something like
Multiplying attention flow and transformers.
That's right. Yeah. They don't exactly talk about integrated gradients, but you can look at the, so they have two components there. One is known as the attention rollout and the attention flow. And you can basically like kind of reverse engineer the attention flow to give you integrated gradients. There's a library called Captum, which I'll link here. And Captum does a lot of integrated gradient stuff. Here it is. I did work with them for a little bit, but yeah, might be of interest.
Sure.
Nice, thank you.
All right, looks like Vincent has a question. How would you do mech-interp on a multimodal model? So 2 points. First is that multimodal models like Clip and multimodal models like Flamingo are two very different things. I just copied in the chat the multimodal neurons paper from, which is on Clip, one with the weird neurons like the teenage neuron. And so the way Clip works is it basically takes in pictures, it takes in text, and it's basically a captioning model that checks whether the text is a good caption by converting both of them to vectors in some latent space and looking at how aligned they are. And they mostly look at the image side and do a bunch of image techniques on it. I think a very cool project would be trying to look on the text side and trying to apply any of the transformer circuits techniques to understand what's going on. So I have like not thought that hard about this, and plausibly a bunch of stuff is weird. Who knows? Then there's multimodal models like Flamingo, which is a variant on Chinchilla, which you can go read the paper on, but they basically took a language model and then shoved on some extra stuff that let it, where you freeze all of the language model parameters, you shove on some extra stuff that takes in images and just like injects the images into the language model's residual stream at some point. And I'm still kind of shocked that this works, because this is such a ridiculous thing to do. And we don't know how GPT-4 does this, but like my money is on some variant of Flamingo. And I believe someone recently open sourced a version of Flamingo. And I think that, trying to understand things like, can you find circuits in this model? Can you see interesting things, what the new heads you add are doing, things like that? Can you use any of the image model techniques like feature visualization? Feel pretty exciting to me. And yeah, general caution, I highly recommend trying to do these projects on smaller models, like max 2 billion parameters. Trying to work with like 20 billion plus parameter models is going to be an enormous nightmare unless you know what you're doing and have a lot of GPUs. And I don't actually know whether the open source Flamingo style models are small enough that I think it's tractable to try doing something on them. Yes, there is a reason I open sourced a bunch of toy language models. Tiny models are great. All right.
Yes.
Doesn't look like there is any further questions. Shall we close there?
Yes, I think that sounds perfect. And thank you very much for everyone. Yes, to Neel Nanda, basically. And we'll see if we run out of animal names for all these models before the singularity. But thank you so much for coming by, and it's been great having you. Let's give him a hand again, and thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm very excited to see what stuff people produce over the weekend.
Yes.
I just linked in the chat to a guide I wrote for the previous hackathon that is probably integrated into the current materials. It's like how I think you can get enough momentum you could actually get somewhere in a weekend.
Nice.
Right.
Perfect.
So, good luck.
Ciao.